Welcome, historians! We're going to start today's lesson with a story about our friend Blair. Blair is an artist and designer. She wants to design and create her own artistic print t-shirts. Blair borrows money from family members to start a small shirt business, which she, of course, names Thread Blair. Blair spends her own time designing the shirts and pays a printing company to print 100 shirts. A plain t-shirt costs $3, and the cost of printing a shirt is $7, for a total of $10. Blair sells the shirts for $15, making a profit of $5 per shirt. Pretty good, right? Blair realizes, however, that her shirts are becoming quite popular. The demand for shirts, in other words, the number of people willing and able to purchase a shirt, is higher than her supply of shirts, or how many shirts she has available. What would you do if you were Blair? We'll catch up with Blair later. For now, though, consider this. Blair is able to fulfill her dream to design and sell her own snazzy t-shirts because of history. We told you history was cool. Well, let me explain. It's more than just history. The market exchange, Blair creating a product and selling it for a profit, comes from the Industrial Revolution. We're going to discuss the historic roots of an economic system called capitalism. Our guiding questions are: what is capitalism? What were some of the positive effects of industrial era capitalism? What were some of the negative effects of industrial era capitalism? And our big picture question: is capitalism a fair economic and social system? In order to understand what capitalism is, we first need to understand the setting in which it grew. Capitalism as a system has its roots in industrial England. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, society was based on feudalism. Let's throw it back in time to remind you how exactly feudalism works. Shall we hop in the time machine to, say, Unit 2? Okay, all you, Brian.
Think of feudal Europe as a pyramid based on reciprocity, exchanging things with others for mutual benefit. The idea that I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. The king was at the top of the pyramid. He owned the land and made the laws. Sometimes he'd grant pieces of land or fiefs to influential families, the nobles, expecting something in return: loyalty, money, and an army. To acquire the money, nobles would collect taxes, which would go to the king. To acquire the army, nobles would offer some of their land to professional soldiers, knights, who in return would pledge their army to the nobles and, by extension, to the king. At the bottom of the pyramid were the peasants, who worked the land and provided goods and services to the nobles and knights in return for protection.
Wow, thanks for that recap, Brian. As you may have noticed, the peasants, who made up the majority of the population, had very little economic power. In fact, they only received protection, which you could say is pretty important, but they had little else. Peasants engaged in subsistence farming and lacked opportunities for economic advancement. They were self-sufficient, producing their own food and textiles, but even if they could produce a surplus, other peasants lacked the means to buy them. Feudalism aimed to sustain the population's basic needs, to provide luxury for the landowners, and to maintain a military force for the king. Feudalism's decline in the late medieval era led to a rise in small-scale for-profit trading by merchants. However, economic mobility was still very limited, and individuals had little choice in their occupation. Fast forward to the industrial era. Machines facilitated efficient mass production, enabling individuals to reliably produce goods on a large scale. Job specialization also meant that people purchased items they couldn't produce themselves, and they had the financial means to do so. Which leads us to Capitalism is an economic system in which the means of production, such as factories, land, and resources, are owned and controlled by private individuals and businesses, instead of the king or the government. In a capitalist system, the production and distribution of goods and services are driven by the pursuit of profit. A figure often associated with capitalism is Scottish economist Adam Smith, whose book, The Wealth of Nations, advocated for a free market, where supply and demand determines prices, and individuals are free to choose what to produce, buy, and sell. Smith contextualized capitalism in day-to-day life when he said, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest." A butcher doesn't provide food out of charity, but as a means of generating income for themselves by offering a needed good or service to others. Consumers, in turn, use these services to fulfill their own needs, such as putting food on the table, and compensate the provider in exchange for the service. In its most extreme form, capitalism is not regulated by the government. This is known as laissez-faire, a French term meaning allowed to do. Some industrial economies were heading in that direction, but that wasn't necessarily a good thing. You see, capitalism is complicated. So let's now dig into how capitalism played out in the industrial era, both for the good and the bad. So now, let's review. What is capitalism? Capitalism had some tremendous benefits during the industrial era. Ideally, capitalism results in self-determination. Capitalism allows individuals to invest their capital or resources as they please to increase their wealth. In the industrial era, capitalists could invest in industries of their choice, based on their profitability, promoting the best ideas and filtering out less useful ones. Capitalism enables individuals to select their profession, allowing them to maximize their productivity and income. This is different from feudalism, where peasants were tied to a single plot of land, regardless of their abilities or interests. In a capitalist system, employees have the option to voluntarily leave their job for a more desirable one. Next, a capitalist system results in constant innovation. This motivates people and businesses to create new and better products, to find new customers, and to increase profits, resulting in improved and more accessible goods and services. This played out in the industrial age, with a constant improvement of existing technology being used to produce better quality or lower cost products designed to attract the consumer. Next, capitalism results in consumer needs being met. If demand for a good or service is high, prices go up. That's because a producer knows they can charge more for a product and people will still buy it. This motivates producers to make more of this good until needs are met and prices go down again. For example, during the industrial age, railroad transportation expanded rapidly, greatly increasing the demand for coal to power the locomotives. Next, capitalism results in efficient use of resources. In capitalism, a resource is only utilized if it fulfills a need, and if there is an excess of a product or service, production is reduced to minimize waste. For example, during industrialization, the use of wood as a fuel source decreased in favor of coal. Therefore, careful observation of this trend prevented excessive harvesting of lumber. The principles of meeting needs and efficient use of resources also apply to economic sectors. High demand for a sector, such as industrial coal mining, leads to higher wages and thus more people entering that sector. Low demand leads to lower salaries and a shift toward more useful professions. Capitalism results in an increase in the economy. Capitalism incentivizes innovation, hard work, and meeting consumer needs, leading to increased production and economic growth. Let's consider England's gross domestic product, or GDP, over a 160-year period. GDP measures a country's economic output in goods and services in a single year. In the 80 years prior to the Industrial Revolution, England's GDP increased from £7 billion to £13 billion, an 85% increase. In the 80 years after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, however, GDP went from £13 billion to £43 billion, a 230% increase. So, what were some of the positive effects of industrial-era capitalism? This all sounds great, right? But it wasn't all positive. In fact, you can likely already predict some negative effects of capitalism. You've already learned about some of them in the lesson Life in Industrial Britain. Capitalism can also result in a power imbalance. In the industrial age, employers had leverage over employees due to the surplus of available workers. This left workers with little choice but to continue working or risk losing their job, which meant they could not support their families. Theoretically, capitalism offers workers choices in employment, but during the industrial age, this was not always the case. This power imbalance led to an increase in the wealth gap. Unbridled capitalism resulted in unequal wealth distribution during the industrial era. The means of production were controlled by a few individuals and businesses who reaped the benefits of the economic boom, while the working class remained stagnant. You may recall this graph, which shows the vast difference between working-class English and upper-class business owners who earned wages over 100 times higher. As capitalism aimed to increase profit, factory owners sought ways to increase their own wealth, often at the expense of others. Between the power imbalance and the increasing wage gap, the early capitalist system resulted in worker exploitation. Many company owners viewed employees as a means of profit, taking advantage of the power imbalance. Increased profits meant that a company owner had an incentive to reduce worker pay and increase working hours. During the early industrial age, workers worked up to 16 hours in factories, leading to tiredness and accidents. Workplace injuries were common, including the loss of limbs, and injured workers were not compensated for missed work. Despite the workplace hazards and long hours, workers were paid very little. As wages were low, some families were forced to have their children work in the factories. Company owners were motivated to hire children as they could pay them a lower wage. Children under 14 accounted for 20% of the labor force in the early 19th century English textile factories, with many starting work before age 10. This created a cycle of lesser privilege for the working class population as children grew up without education. Thus, they were unable to gain skills for higher paying jobs, leading to a life of servitude to industry bosses, perpetuating the wealth and power gap. It could also lead to monopolies. Unrestrained capitalism led to the rise of monopolies, where one industrialist could buy out their competitors and control an entire industry, leaving workers with no other employment options. Industrialists colluded to keep wages low, making it difficult for workers to improve their standard of living. If a worker attempted to negotiate for better pay or working conditions, they would be fired and replaced with someone else who would accept the lower wages. This created a cycle where all industrialists could benefit, while their employees were left with little choice but to accept the poor conditions. Finally, unbridled capitalism can lead to environmental exploitation. Capitalism's focus on profit has often led to the exploitation of the earth and its resources for short-term gain, disregarding the long-term consequences. During the Industrial Revolution, exploitation of natural resources and burning fossil fuels caused short-term environmental damage and the pollution of water, air, and soil. However, it also led to long-term climate change due to increased greenhouse gas emissions. So, what were some of the negative effects of industrial era capitalism? Governments valued industrialization for its benefits, such as infrastructure, productivity, and wealth, but were hesitant to acknowledge its negative effects for fear of hindering progress. Governments encouraged further industrialization and promoted free trade to stimulate the global economy during the mid-19th century. England reduced or eliminated most of its tariffs to promote free movement of goods and capital, which encouraged other countries to industrialize as well. So do you see why capitalism is complicated? This is why today, pure laissez-faire capitalism doesn't exist. Governments regulate capitalism with taxes, environmental and worker protection laws, and other measures. These regulations allow for the positive effects of capitalism, such as innovation and self-determination, while mitigating its negative effects. In our PDF, we'll revisit our friend Blair and play out some scenarios she may encounter as she gets Thread Blair off the ground. In our historical study, there were some growing pains yet to come. Exploited by means of overwork, abuses of worker safety, and low wages, some economists and workers began to look for a solution. In the following lessons, you'll observe two different approaches to reaching the solution. The first involves the regulation of capitalism through groups called labor unions. The second is an entirely new economic system. In fact, this new system marks the beginning of an ideological battle that will continue to play out all the way through the end of our course and beyond. We'll examine this from different angles. You'll get my joke after a couple of lessons. Yep, because history is everywhere.
Hey.